Hello and welcome to the first episode in this summer series, George Jones Meets, where I meet and speak and interview specialists in their area and in their field as part of the AFC Wimbledon backroom team. Today I'm joined by Chris McConnell, who is Head of Sports Science at AFC Wimbledon. Chris, thank you for joining us.
No problem.
So, Chris, this is your first full season with us after joining the January of the season before. So your head of sports science is your role. So could you just give us a brief interview in what that role actually entails?
So to cut a long story short, I'm responsible for keeping and maintaining players on the grass, making sure that they're in optimal health and in optimal fitness, and everything that encompasses all of that basically. So whether that's sort of strength and conditioning programs or helping liaise with the coach in terms of what's optimal to do on the grass. That's fundamentally what I do, and that can take sort of many different facets, whether that's training, whether that's recovery, whether that's nutrition. It's just sort of marrying everything all up together to make sure that we've got players who are available to train, to develop and to obviously perform on a Saturday or a Tuesday in the games throughout the season.
So looking back last season, like I said, first full season as heading up a department in men's football. Challenging season, on and off the pitch for a wide variety of reasons. Before we talk about the sort of one-off reasons for it, I think one of the main things people think of this year is the long-term injuries to Ollie Palmer and Terrell's illness. How much is helping and aiding those players' recovery a big part of your role?
So, in terms of Terrell, that was certainly more doctors as opposed to anyone who was actually associated with the football club. So that was more Tim Maynard, the head physio, who dealt with him. In terms of Ollie, again, that was sort of quite a lot of liaison with both myself and Tim, just in terms of trying to recuperate him. So when he first sort of come to the club, he'd obviously come off the back of a surgery. So we were looking to build up his fitness, and him being in a new environment, it was taking some time, and we were basically trying to reintegrate into sort of the approaches of how we played at the time and how the manager wanted to work. When he first sort of come back, again, it's kind of inevitable that players sort of pick up little niggles, and it can obviously delay them coming into the team. In our heads, we sort of thought he'd probably be back in around November, which he did. Unfortunately, we come into sort of congested fixture schedules where it's sort of 3 games a week, which wasn't ideal for him to be coming back into in terms of gameplay, but also just in terms of his training structure was quite disrupted as a result because they train less from where they're playing more. And then obviously we had our little COVID break as well. And again, it was just sort of rumbling on in the background, just in terms of his current issues. So, Ollie had managed to get himself into the team, and he wasn't really happy with it. So, we all felt, Ollie included, it was the best course of action, just to take a little bit of a break, and again, just sort of strengthen the area in terms of his resilience to certain movements, to then try and sort of roll them out towards the latter end of the season. And again, probably in an ideal world, if we were in a slightly different situation, we probably would have been a little bit more careful with him, just in terms of his game exposure came very quickly, where he was introduced into sort of Saturday, Tuesdays. But credit where credit's due, he was very professional for all that time, and he managed to cope with the demands. And yeah, I think what he's done in that time can't really be overstated. So it's balancing between pushing the player at the right times, but it's also balancing listening to the player, how he's presenting objectively, as well as sort of his subjective, how he reports himself in terms of his subjective feedback, and also just sort of looking at the risk and reward in terms of where we can push him and where we can't push him, and yeah, so it's just sort of balancing him across good training exposure as well as giving him adequate time to recover, but also to adapt to certain exercises that he was doing. So hopefully we can get him in even better shape coming into pre-season, and he can hit the ground running once again.
I think we're all certainly hoping for that. He was a massive player for us in the second half of the season. Just going back on something you touched on there, that COVID break right at the sort of end of October, start of November, which then did lead into that mad run of games where we were playing Saturday, Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday. That COVID break, how difficult was that for you to manage? Obviously, you had players at different stages of self-isolation, or some who were suffering quite badly from COVID. How difficult was it to make sure that everyone was in a state so that when they could come back, they hit the ground running?
Well, in fairness, we weren't really given the time to come back, so to speak, to hit the ground running. I think we had the full group training 2 days before the first game of that 4 week, 4 games in 9 days, and then 10 games in 29 days. So it was almost a case of like everybody's going to be back. Everybody would have had sort of 10 days, 2 weeks off, depending on if they'd tested positive or negative. In terms of the self-isolation players, we just sort of asked them what they had available at their houses, what equipment they had, whether there was any cardio equipment, and just got a little bit creative with what we could do with them, just to try and keep them active and keep them ticking over as best as we can within the guidelines. In terms of the ones that tested positive, unfortunately, you can't really do anything with them until they're certainly asymptomatic. So that's got to be that was going to be a 10-day period regardless, and then it's just a case of I think we were able to get them in a little bit earlier as the negative players. They had to self-isolate for 14 days. So we managed to get an extra 2 training sessions into them, I think, prior to them coming back, which probably would have helped. I'd say in terms of managing that period, all we done was basically analyse what players could probably cope with those demands best, and then sort of factor it all the way down there. So there were some that were probably on prescribed sort of minutes, and others who we felt or we were confident would be able to come through that period relatively unscathed. And it was just looking at their data, whether that's match data, whether it's their training data, as well as how they were feeling subjectively, and just try and fulfil the fixtures really with a good and adequate performance. Really, I think it's probably well documented that Ant Hartigan played, I think, all 5 games, I think, in a 12-day period, and that's because he was unbelievably fit at the time. And I think that was a testament to his professionalism throughout the time. I think it was a negative test. I think he tested negative at the time, just in terms of how he trained before that little period, but also how he trained within it. And then not everybody was probably up to outstanding in terms of fitness. He's certainly one of the fittest aerobically in the club. So it's just sort of managing those players through as best as we could in terms of making they're going to be selected. Yes, but I think we need to do really is just plan as best as you can for situations. But it's fair to say I definitely don't want that set of circumstances back again anytime soon.
You mentioned Anthony Hartigan there. Obviously, he ended the season out on loan at Newport. How difficult is it for you to be able to keep track of his data and to make sure players are looked after when they are out on loan, whether that's like Anthony at League 2 level or to the boys who are out in non-league?
Well, ideally, we're going to go a little bit with a different way with it next season. I think we'd like to probably have a little bit of a closer relationship with football clubs, certainly in non-league, but also if our players go off to league clubs. It's a bit similar to, like, we're going to try and operate, I think, quite similarly to how when we take loan players in from other clubs, they're in probably a lot more regular contact than what we are. But we just sort of do internal measurements. We just sort of track how many games that they're playing, their minutes that they're playing, as well as just sort of loose training exposure. We don't necessarily want to interrupt what other teams are doing. So, for example, Newport were flying and hadn't reported any problems to either of the coaches or myself. He was quite happy there. So we feel no real need to get involved. I think when teams going to non-league, when players are going to non-league, their training exposure might be a little bit different. For example, they might be going on loan to part-time teams. So it's just sort of getting ahead in terms of what they do, what their training looks like, as well as where we can supplement their own bits and their own development into that schedule as well.
So obviously you touched on it there of how we have to interact with loanees, how when they're coming into us. How difficult is that for you to obviously making sure that we've got the data we need to make sure that the training program with us is tailored to them, but also making sure their parent clubs are happy with what they're getting and their sports scientists are getting the data they need?
So the ones that I've dealt with this year, obviously Brighton, a little bit of Leicester. So like Brighton, they generally stayed in touch every month. They just asked for a little check in with Ryan, just how he was doing, how he was responding, what his data looked like over the previous month. Initially, it's just sort of that they just asked for like an outline in terms of the schedule, really. So what does our training week look like? And then just sort of from that, we've created loan reports, or they'll give us sort of loan reports to fill out, where we just sort of entering the data just in terms of their metrics, in terms of what they've covered across the week and in games. And then they, well, I'm not sure what they do with it, to be honest, but I assume that they log it, at least potentially analyse it, but they don't necessarily interfere in terms of what we're doing. What I try to do is at the beginning of the season, depending on that player's exposure. So if we just take sort of Ryan, for example, given certain types of like instances, for example, like congested weeks, asking if they've been exposed to that, how has he reported from this, would it affect his prior injury history, just to try and build up more of a profile around the player so that we can make the best decisions on the ground to keep them fully fit through the season.
Now, obviously, one of the big changes that happened midway through last season was Mark Robinson being promoted to first-team head coach. How much did your role change? What were the demands of players difference? What were the main differences for you since he came in?
So first of all, when a new manager comes in, they generally have their own way of playing, which is usually quite different to what was being played before. So under Glim, we were a bit more of a counter-attacking team. We had less possession of the football, whereas the current gaffer, he wanted to move to a more possession-based style of football. So straight away, we've got different demands, and that's going to create slight positional demands or positional demands changing fundamentally. So if you almost imagine scaling a mountain, we used to play here. The current manager wants to play here. It's almost just making sure that build up to the intensity, the increased volume or the decreased volume, whatever it may be, just in terms of making sure that those demands aren't jumped too quickly, that we build up to those demands so that we decrease the likelihood of injury. So I'd say fundamentally, probably one of the biggest things that probably changed is just sort of not necessarily managing expectations, but just helping the coaches understand that how we train will have an effect on the players' bodies, and it will take time for them to adapt to that playing style or that new intensity, whatever it may be. It will take time for them to grow and develop into the players that they want to use. Also, I think there's certainly a little bit more formation flexibility. While that doesn't necessarily change positional demands too much, there'll be a higher emphasis in terms of certain positions. So again, it's just sort of making sure that they're fulfilling the playing style and making sure that the players are fit for purpose. So previously they were fit for one purpose, now we're trying to make them fit for another purpose. So that's quite a difficult thing to do in season while managing preventable injuries. Non-preventable injuries you can't do anything about. But yeah, it's just, I'd say that was the biggest change, in just making sure that they were robust enough and they had the capacity to fulfil both the season ends, perform maximally and perform to the gaffer's liking. And probably how we kicked on at the end of the season suggests that players understood the new demands and they could cope with the new demands and they could flourish under those new demands when it was called upon. So I'd probably say that was probably the biggest difference. The biggest change. In terms of changes to my role day to day, not necessarily too much, I'd say. I wouldn't say it changes too much in terms of structure of days are generally the same. I think more than anything, it's just the pitch-based prescription that would have changed. Some things have been taken off of me that potentially wasn't part of my job, so to speak, which is fine. It's more just sort of sharing the workload. But yeah, it's whenever there's change in football, there's normally going to be reactions or potential negatives that we try to mitigate against and minimise.
So obviously you mentioned sort of it was working it up to make sure they were hit the standards expected of them under Robbo. Obviously that's going to be a big bit of pre-season. Last year we had an unusually long pre-season, I think it's fair to say, in terms of the length of it. How big a target is it this year? Obviously Robbo said we're going to have perhaps a delayed games program this pre-season to allow more work ahead of that. How big a role do you think you're going to have to play to make sure that we can hit the ground running and have as good a start this year as we did last?
Well, I think simply to put it on my shoulders last year, is in terms of just like having a good pre-season and a good start, like it's probably wrong. Fundamentally, it comes down to all of us in the building. We all consult and we all come to a measured decision as a team. I'd probably say in pre-season, there is obviously a heightened focus in terms of setting the foundations and building capacity in terms of what we do. But you can be the fittest team in terms of numbers and in terms of tests, but not have any game understanding. And it's important we marry the two together in terms of that they're effective movers, they're robust enough to cope with week on week congested schedules as well as the season. But that's built across 45 weeks of the season as opposed to 6. So a lot of emphasis is put on pre-season, certainly for sports scientists. But fundamentally, I think if we're consistent in terms of what we do on a week-to-week basis, then fitness will grow through pre-season. It'll also grow through the season, and it's important that the players are effective in the formation that they're playing in, as well as understanding wholly what the manager and what Rob Tuvey wants the boys to do, as well as sort of all of the niche areas such as restart. So it's fundamentally a big learning block, and I think if we work as a holistic team like we've done last year, then hopefully we'll have another good start to the season.
Well, we've spoken quite extensively about data so far, and I believe you've got some data charts you're willing to share for us. Yep. So if my colleague would be able to bring these up. So if you could just talk us through all of these pieces of data.
Yeah, so what we've got here is basically an example of a match report from our games throughout League One. So this is a particular example. Picked a game where we've won 3-0. Unfortunately, all the rest of the data is made up. But in terms of the first slide, it's basically a team overview. So we can see how much the team has done as a whole across our KPIs. So our KPIs are total distance, walking distance, high speed actions, high speed running, explosive distance, as well as accels and decel count. So total distance is pretty self-explanatory. It's the whole team's output, how much they've covered in the game. Walking distance is an average across the whole team, so it's a percentage of how much they've walked on average. And then the count of actions is a sum across the whole team. Sum of the distance covered in high speed is the next one. Same for explosive distance. So explosive distance is fundamentally the distance that's covered when accelerating or decelerating maximally. And then the accels and decels, again, what we define as maximal accels and decels or high types of movement, the distance that are covered in those types of movements. And then underneath, we've got basically a leaderboard in terms of where we've ranked versus ourselves in other games. So we can get a picture in terms of how hard we've worked in comparison to the rest of the season.
So next slide.
So we get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty stuff here. So this is basically a 15-minute breakdown. So the match is broken down into 15-minute blocks, starting from the first whistle, moving all the way through to the last. Again, just in our sort of 6 major KPIs. So the way that we look at this is basically to see what areas of the game have we been the most productive in terms of our KPIs, and also to sort of see if there's been any drop-off amongst the team. And any potential reason as to why that is. So, for example, if we have an injury break, it could explain as to why they might be a little bit less productive in the 60 to 75 minute mark, as an example. Equally, it could mean that potentially there's an area of weakness in terms of our ability to maintain either work outputs, density, or simply productivity in terms of our sort of explosive movements or our high speed actions. And that could obviously lead to something that we look to rectify during training, either in the next week or for a little bit of a more longer term block moving forward, just so that we can try and increase their capacity and their ability to do that in a game. So again, just moving through all of the KPIs, just sort of looking through that, just to sort of see if we've managed to maintain our output across a game, and sort of see if there's any reason or explanation as to why we perform the way that we have in breaking it down in 15-minute blocks. So this is basically a player overview. So this is probably what the players are most interested when they see something like this. So this is just a snapshot in terms of the KPIs, including maximum speed for what they've managed to achieve in the game. So they get to see how they performed in the game from a data perspective versus their other positions within the team. And also like speed, they're all pretty competitive on speed, so they like sort of seeing who's been the quickest in the game as well. And it's just fundamentally just a brief little snapshot just in terms of their outputs in the game. And yeah, they all seem to take quite a bit of an interest in it. So yeah, it's just a quick brief overview just in terms of what they've done. So this is a little bit more of an extensive breakdown. So this is what sort of I probably look at the most, just in terms of what the players have done across many different metrics. They colour the top three of each KPI has been colour coded, just in terms of the top three performers for those particular KPIs. We also just sort of look at total distance per minute and a few more metrics in terms of this. We just sort of flag this up to the coaches just in terms of who's potentially achieved the highest, what positions have had the highest demands on them throughout this particular game. And yeah, we just sort of use this to basically marry up the stimulus between training as well as games, just to make sure that in certain instances we're training at match intensity or we're covering a certain percentage of what we class as match load in terms of our sort of daily objectives from the physical side. So this one's just a little bit further analysis. So again, just in terms of what I'd say are four major KPIs. So our total distance, our high speed actions, our high speed running, as well as our explosive distance. Just where the players have performed versus themselves throughout the season. So it's just 4 bar graphs, and then sort of in the middle we've got a dot graph or a line graph in between that sort of shows their average data points for each KPI. So we can have a look at maybe players who have had let's say an average game in terms of physical output. So we should know sort of how they may respond come Monday morning or Thursday morning when they report back to us. Equally, if players have sort of had a slightly higher amount in terms of their data output, whether they might need a little bit further recovery, and also sort of if unfortunately they haven't been able to achieve what we've wanted them to achieve, they might sort of be available to do some sort of training a little bit earlier than what we might have imagined. So it's just sort of looking across the team in terms of where they performed compared to how they would perform an average, if they've had sort of a higher than usual game or a below or a slightly smaller exposure to the match demands and what they're used to performing. So this, in fairness, was sort of brought in under Glyn. I've not necessarily used this too much since the gaffer's taken charge at the end of January. This is basically just a 5-game average, so it's just a small snapshot in terms of our last 5 games where we performed as a team versus our previous 5 games. So whether we've surpassed that average or whether we've gone below that average. And yeah, so we've basically got two sort of average lines, one of which is the 5-game average as well as our season average. So we can just get a little picture in terms of how we performed in each one of the games versus the previous 5 games, and whether our training prescription needs to be altered as a result. And also we can use it as a metric to sort of see if they're adapting to the training demands and also how the manager wants us to play. Yeah, and finally, depending on if the boys are still awake, and maybe the coaches are still awake come the end of the report. But this is basically just a snapshot of our season, just in terms of all of the games, what we've achieved in our KPIs. On the top row, we've obviously got our win, loss, and draw columns. So what our data looks like when we win, when we lose, when we draw, just to sort of see if we can build any correlations. And then moving through sort of high speed actions, high speed running, as well as explosive distance. And what we try to do is we try and look for correlations fundamentally to sort of see if there is a number or an average number or almost like a threshold to see if if there's sort of like a particular number or a certain threshold that we need to hit in one of our KPIs to see to probably get some form of positive result. What I've found is this season is that number is probably elusive, as every game is fundamentally different. You can have a really, really good game where you're very proactive and your data is really low. Equally, you can have a really, really productive game where the other team's playing really well, and it's requiring us to work a bit harder off the ball or on the ball to create chances, to keep possession or to win it back, to win the game, and therefore our data's through the roof. So we just basically look at this to sort of see if and where there has been any overachievement or underachievement, and to just try and build sort of correlations across what, on average, each one of our players are going to be exposed to in a game.
Well, thank you very much for sharing those, Chris. I think certainly we've all learned a huge amount from those. Certainly, it was really interesting that final slide, seeing a lot of the data trends, and especially you could see certainly from the Ipswich game towards the run, so a lot of those KPIs certainly picked up a bit in that running run we had, and I think that was certainly interesting to see that the data backed up what we were all able to see, in the performances. So looking at that data, just how do we collect all of that? How is that all collected, and how is it tracked?
So we have a partnership with a GPS provider called Catapult. So you probably would have seen quite a few of the players, whether it's under their shirts or any sort of training pictures. They have like a quite a tight vest over their training top or under their match shirt, and there's a little pod just below the neck that basically tracks all their data, and it tracks basically every physical movement you could think of, as well as any sort of like physical actions, depending on the quality of unit that you've got. And then we've sort of narrowed down. We've basically narrowed down everything that it collects into what we feel is most important. And again, from manager to manager, that can change. They might want to look at different things, but we basically filter all those units down into what we feel is most important. So we've got the ability to track these things live, so we can make informed decisions there and then in training, whether we've potentially done too little with players. We can obviously push training on a little bit further, but equally if we've got sort of players returning from injury or players who we feel might need a slightly modified prescription, we can have sort of data thresholds or data targets for them to hit before we look to reduce their training load. And equally if we feel that we're overrunning or doing too much, it can be a tool to obviously shorten the session. So we try and use the data live, but basically all this data comes down into a cloud, which we look to download onto a computer. This data is then sort of clipped using their velocity trace, and then that's basically all downloaded onto a server online, which then sort of spits out reports, and then we can either use reports that the provider makes for us, or what we tend to do is we sort of put it into our own sort of Excel sheet, into our own databases, which then formulates the reports that we want to see on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis.
So you mentioned we were able to get the data live and use it in real time. Is there any games that come to mind this season where you've been able to present some of the data live to either Glyn, Robbo, or one of the coaching staff that's made a big difference to the outcome of a game, you feel in particular?
I wouldn't say any's probably had an influence on the game itself. Glyn, I'd say, was a little bit more familiar with GPSs than Robbo, and that's partly due to his other experiences at other football clubs. So, like in terms of a game, we'd have sort of probably quite regular conversations with sort of what players are achieving what, or what the data is fundamentally looking like across the team. I'd say the only real time that it probably has, the only time it has the biggest influence is when players are returning from injury, or they're on what I'd call sort of modified match minutes. So, like using Ollie as an example, certainly when he first come back, it's just sort of keeping tabs on sort of what his data was looking like in games, and also where he's playing extensive minutes, just fundamentally what his work output would look like. And I'd say probably one of the games where it was considered the most. In fairness, I don't think he was playing in this one, but when we played Arsenal under 23s in the Carabao Cup, I think it was. It was quite a different. It was a very different output in terms of probably what we'd experienced in League One. They were a very, very possession-based team that kept the ball for long periods of time, and the ball didn't really go out of play, which can be a huge effect on, which can have a huge effect on people's outputs. So some of it's by eye, and it's just simply looking at sort of what probably a regular game would look like in terms of their average numbers in certain KPIs, and then just sort of noticing differences in terms of those KPIs, whether they're higher or lower. But I think it's probably a little bit dangerous if I'm going up to a manager and saying, like, well, like our data's like huge, like you should consider taking him off, or you should consider like it doesn't have any effect in terms of formations, in terms of like, well, if we change this formation, our data is going to be higher, or we're going to be more compact, and so our data is going to be lower. Like the manager's got enough things on his mind without me chiming into his ear to sort of start saying about numbers, which fundamentally in real time in terms of the game situation are relatively meaningless unless we're tracking a certain player in terms of coming back. Sometimes I think in terms of subjective opinion, like a manager might think that certain players doing a lot, so he wants to check in terms of what their data looks like, which might help inform his decision later. Or equally, if he feels like a player could be a little bit more productive, he might want to see their data there and then to sort of see if it's backing up what he's seeing with his eyes. So I generally sort of try and stay pretty quiet unless I'm asked about certain things, in which case I'll obviously show them the data and I'll give my opinion to the best of my ability.
So one of the main things this year in terms of sort of as a noticeable thing from a fan point of view is obviously the lack of fans in grounds. We only had fans at one game this season in competitive fixtures, which was Charlton away. Obviously, fans hopefully back for August at Plough Lane. Firstly, how much are you looking forward to that? But also, how much do you think it will make the data this year difficult to judge because players will have a bit more energy and a bit more sort of spirit about them, obviously having fans in? Does that change how you do things or how you judge the data?
No, like I'd say in terms of data, I don't really think in terms of the actual number that's provided doesn't really change. I think it's almost mental stimulation or slightly more motivation in the players, and so that they feel like they're working hard. I think it'd probably be interesting to see sort of in the first 5 to 10 games what their data looks like with the inclusion of fans. But like just judging this season's data versus previous years at other football clubs, like the data's not necessarily too different, and every game is fundamentally different. And for a start, playing in a different league in terms of what my previous experience has been at. So like I don't really think my sort of role on a game would change, like in terms of interpreting the data. Fundamentally, it's only me who sees the iPad, unless I've got fans behind me who can maybe see the data and be asked about certain players and then maybe give their opinion. Like I don't think it would change too much in terms of how that data is interpreted. I don't think it would change too much with the introduction of fans in terms of that actual side of things. It'd be really nice, and it'd be certainly a welcome change in terms of just having an atmosphere to like amongst the place. Like we had the test event a couple of weeks ago that I was luckily enough a part of, and it was great just having fans there and having some noise and having some support behind the team that was on the pitch. And yeah, it's certainly like it's definitely a lot emptier without fans in the stadium, giving the boys the best wishes.
So, looking a bit more and trying to find out a bit more about yourself personally, looking back to when you joined us in this January 2019, I think it would have been when you first joined. You joined us, you were assistant first team sports scientist at Millwall and working with their under-23 squad. How was that step up into effectively heading a department at a professional club?
Well, in fairness, I had a great education. Firstly, from Lawrence Bloom, who was the head of sports science at Millwall, and like I was diligent in terms of my job at Millwall, and he allowed me to see sort of as much as possible, so that I could grow as a practitioner. So, like, of course, it's a massive step up in terms of that you're leading a department, you're leading the development pathway amongst your under 23s, as well as sort of keeping you fair, as well as a development plan, obviously for the first team. But you're obviously trying to stick to a good process, so that we make so that we get a good result and have a good performance on a Saturday or a Tuesday. So I think it's certainly a step up, but it's where I wanted to be. So I made sure that I was diligent in terms of my education and in terms of my experience, and just trying to learn as much as I could to take it into my next role, into this role fundamentally, and to make sure that I could do it to the best of my ability. I think you need to physically be in the environment before you can probably come up with a plan in terms of where you want to take the department, in terms of where you want to take the development plan, as well as optimising what's done on the grass and in the gym and everything that encompasses it. So yeah, I think just in terms of that role at Millwall, I was lucky enough to be a dual role. So I was already leading under 23s team. I was already leading the under 23s. So I'd obviously got experience and some knowledge in terms of what's the best route to develop players of that age group, as well as assisting the first team, which probably has a slightly different process, as well as a different goal fundamentally. And just sort of having that safety net where if I did make mistakes, it probably wasn't as much my responsibility, but I had the chance and the ability to make mistakes, so that I won't repeat them, hopefully, in this role here. And I don't think there's been too many of those, certainly probably none that have been noticeable. So hopefully I'll continue that through and continue building the platform for the players to improve, as well as building the department, and also giving other practitioners who are probably trying to tread the same steps as what I have, the platform to grow and improve.
So you mentioned obviously the building and developing the department as the club. Before you, it was Jason Moriarty heading up the club, who has been with the club since deep into the non-league days. So how do you see the department at the club growing, and where do you think it goes in the future?
So when I come in, Jason had set up some terrific foundations. It was a product of 10 years at the football club, and there was a good mentality around sort of sports science. All the boys bought into it, and yeah, just application and their adherence was terrific. I think being new and coming from a different environment, it's a different set of eyes and maybe a slightly different expectation, but I could put together a needs analysis, which I then presented to the football club in terms of what we had, where I could take it with certain investment, and just sort of plan that over the years. So obviously I've been there 18 months, so my first sort of needs analysis come about 3 months, and both myself and Tim just put together one for the end of this season, where we've reviewed what we've done. We've not necessarily monetised our importance, but we've given our mission statement, what our objectives are, and sort of where we've come from last season moving into this season, and in terms of what we've accomplished or what we need to improve upon. And fundamentally, where I see the department, hopefully we get the investment where we can increase the number of staff that we have in the department, so that we can optimise the provision that's given to the players across the first and the 23s, and also leading into the academy. And also with a little bit of equipment, we'll be able to optimise certain areas of our practice as well and take it forward. And if that all equals players being available on the grass, which can then develop, whether they're in our younger age groups or developing our first team and become sort of first team regulars or important first team squad members, whatever it may be. And if it leads to a great process for the manager, which then hopefully leads to performance, which then hopefully leads to points on the boards and positive results. So everything's sort of stepping through. Board has certainly they've certainly appreciated it and took on board sort of what we've had to say certainly this year, and also when I come in, and yeah, I can't fault them at all. They've invested in the vision that I've got for it. So like in terms of the department, it's just fundamentally making the players better and keeping them on the grass first and foremost. Where I see it a little bit further along down the lines, I think will stay with me for the time being.
So obviously you've mentioned Tim Maynard there a couple of times. He joined the club earlier this season as head physiotherapist. How difficult was that for you, obviously, because you'd worked with Stuart Douglas before he left to join Bournemouth? How difficult was that transition mid-season to make sure that, obviously, in an area where nothing can slip through the cracks on a medical side, how difficult was that to make sure everything kept going as smoothly during that transition?
Well, I'll probably say adjustment was probably par for the course for, well, my entire time here so far. Tim was extremely diligent before he come in. Like we shared a couple of calls, and he basically just wanted to know where the department was at, where the current player status, and what we had available. So yeah, he was extremely diligent in terms of sort of doing his research prior to coming in mid-season, which I think is always important. So that when he sort of come in, he was pretty familiar in terms of where the players were at, what things look like, and how a day-to-day sort of structure would work and what the schedule would be. I'll probably argue, unfortunately for him, he's come in 2 days before four games in 9 days. Sorry, so he was certainly thrown at the deep end this season. Again, everybody's got a different set of eyes in terms of where they see the department, in terms of what they feel is best practice. So Dougie was tremendous for me in terms of making me feel welcome when I first come to the football club. So I felt it was my responsibility to sort of help do exactly the same there for Tim, make him feel welcome, taking on board sort of what he's done, what he feels is the best course of action, certainly in terms of the rehabilitation. And yeah, it's just a holistic approach. Like, we get on well. We share very similar views on near everything. I can't think of anything that we don't. So yeah, we work effectively as a team, and it'll only probably improve moving forward into the next season. So yeah, it was a pretty smooth transition. It was just a very bumpy schedule, so to speak, to try and get the gist of things. But he's certainly played his part in terms of keeping the players on the grass.
So, just in case anybody listening to this is feeling interested or wants to know more about sort of sports science, or maybe even look into it as a career, what would you recommend are those steps? How does someone from school to heading up a sports science department at a club?
So I'd probably say I'm quite fortunate to be head of sports science, certainly at my age. So I'd probably say, well, you leave school with GCSEs, sixth form or college, get yourself A levels or BTECs, and then to become a sports scientist, probably have to go to university. I'd say 95% of practitioners, certainly in professional football, have a degree. So take an undergraduate degree in sports science or football science amongst the universities in the country, and then I'd done a sandwich year. It was part of my university degree where I'd done a year's work placement, working in the field of my choosing, which was professional football. So I'd done that at Watford at the time. A lot of other clubs, including us, offer the chance to take on board to take interns on for seasonal periods to help them build their experience. So, like, you can either take 3 years or 4 years at university like that. But just throughout your university degree, whether you do that, like, look to get as much applied experience as you can, whether that's coaching youth teams, whether that's coaching grassroots teams, whether that's just applying at professional clubs or non-league clubs, just to gain that experience, because that's what I hold most dearly when I'm looking to employ any member of staff. That's what held me in good stead. So the experience is just as important as the education. Graduate with a good mark in your degree, certainly, and then once you've graduated, again, try and get experience. I'd say certainly if you haven't managed to get it in during your university studies, but I'd certainly recommend to do that during that time. If you're unfortunate, if you're unfortunate enough not to be able to get experience off your own back, then look to do a master's degree, a postgraduate master's, or look to do an applied master's that's in connection with a football club. So I know quite a few football clubs now are going down the route of having master's students that conduct research, work for the team, alongside sort of like their research project. So I'd certainly look for one or two of those, and then yeah, you're probably out in the big bad world, but certainly like the first part of any recruitment process is the CV. So you need to pack out your CV with as much experience as you can. Certainly in terms of interns, that's what I'm looking for. Probably first, as well as personality. If they've got applied experience, then they've probably got the personality to survive in a football environment, because it can be quite high pressure situations with quick turnarounds and long working hours. So they need to be fit for purpose. And yeah, like do as best as you can in your internship. Like throughout my time as an intern, I put in as much. I got out exactly what I put in. So the more you put in, the more you get out, and probably the better rapport you make with the senior members of staff in your department, as well as across the football operations. And yeah, if you build a good professional relationship with people, then you're more likely to be offered a job of some kind at the end of it, or be recommended to other jobs. So I've done 3 internships at 2 different clubs, and it was my boss at Charlton that fundamentally took me to Millwall, who I then worked under for 3.5 years, and then off the back of that I got headhunted for here. So it's just working hard, building your knowledge, building your experience, and being a reliable and a consistent practitioner, and yeah, generally you probably can't go wrong there, and yeah, just building relationships like that, I'd say. But yeah, I'd certainly say if you're coming from school, I think the biggest thing that graduates miss out upon, and I recognise it can be a hard thing to do, but it's getting that experience. So in terms of you being 18, like if you've been lucky enough to play in academies, it's a great starting point. But equally, if you've managed to have some form of coaching experience, regardless of sport, that will hold you in a better stead than, let's say, you're working in like the retail field as an example. For me, it's all about some form of applied experience.
So thank you so much, Chris, for joining us. It was very educational, very interesting, and hopefully it's been entertaining as well. So thank you so much for joining us this evening, and have a good summer.
No problem. Thanks for having me on, George.
Thank you.
Cheers.